Guys, I'm glad that we're back and able to continue the conversation. We had a fantastic conversation back in the month of March, where we started introducing this idea that organizations have to really track what's happening in the industry. And there are many drivers that were causing us to respond and react that's out there. Some of them we're well aware of them, some that are more passive. But just to take a kind of a look back at what we talked about, we kind of looked at this model here that talked about how the pace of change is accelerating as time is going on. I think if we look at our businesses, as every day goes by, the things that are happening at a faster and faster pace, which means we have to respond faster. And when we look at this, there's a number of industry drivers that are happening that are changing on an ongoing basis. We have no control over those. They're going to happen regardless of what we want to do. Those drivers sometimes fall into kind of what we call five major buckets. The first one focused on what are the expectations of the market? What do our customers want? What do our patients want? What are, where is the business going to go in the future? The second element that we have is landscape. Our competitors shape what we do. Our competitors may open up new offices. They may change their business models. They may be able to lower the cost of delivery of their service. We've all seen stories of the video store that we used to go to that was on the corner being replaced and non-existent, with us now watching streaming movies on TV on demand, wherever we happen to be. So we see those kind of changes where our competitors are changing the landscape that we're in. Either we compete and we keep pace with them, or we fall behind and eventually cease to exist. We talked about crisis events. We just recently experienced this with COVID, and we've had hurricanes, and we have civil unrest, all kinds of other crisis moments that causes our business models to change. We have the ever increasing security threat landscape. Just when you think you've seen the worst of it, it seems there's the next one comes out and it's even worse than the last one. And we have to respond to those. Then the last area we talk about is regulatory changes. Our governments are changing rules, regulations. We have to be compliant. How do we keep pace with that? The compliance standards are becoming more rigorous and they demand more of our time and attention. So how do we respond? So as these drivers change in the ideal world, as they start to change, we've already met them, we've already planned for them, and we're able to implement them. And as we look at that teal line that's on the screen today, we would follow and track that line perfectly, but that's not the case. When we're trying to implement these changes at key paths, we're always out of sync to some level where the drivers are. And what happens is the orange line represents our response to those initiatives, to those changes. Sometimes we're on track and we track perfectly with the line that industry is going at. Sometimes we'll lag behind that and we drift. That gap between the blue line and the orange line is really the gap that we talk about. This is where we look at organizations being able to keep pace with change or not. The bigger this gap becomes, the more critical it becomes for our business to become more aligned with where industry is going. The bigger the gap is, the less responsiveness we are to what's happening around us. So I want to stop here for a second, and I just want to bring this back to Laird a little bit. We talked about this last time quite a bit. So I'd just like to kind of get your opinion from what you've seen. You've worked with a lot of organizations in healthcare specifically, on all sides: ambulatory care, community health, hospitals, urgent care. Do you feel that this gap is staying pretty narrow and status quo? Do you think it's growing? What do you think is happening within the healthcare industry with the gap?
Tim, thanks. What I'm seeing, and again, just from a sample audience that I've looked at and spoke to, I've actually seen the gap getting wider. And what's interesting is the gap got wider, not because the practice didn't invest in the technology. They actually did. But unfortunately, they didn't complete the investment. So for example, if I had old expectations that I would, let's talk about expectations of the market. As a patient, I had my old expectations of my practitioner. And then suddenly they've invested in new technology. They did it with the right reason. They wanted to address my new expectations that I brought into this market from my experience in health and transportation or finance, whatever the case may be. But they didn't complete the deal. They bought the technology, but they failed to recognize that transformation is not about simply changing technology, but you're also affecting processes and people.
Hmm.
And so what's happened is that gap got wider because now you're no longer meeting my old expectations and you're not meeting my new expectations. And so that gap got wider with regard to that driver. Another thing has happened is, as while they were doing that, and we're dealing with the crisis event of COVID, well, COVID accelerated some of these transformations.
Hmm.
Investments were being made there, but unfortunately, with those investments, then we created new threats. The threat landscape has gotten bigger.
Yep.
And so not only is the gap getting wider because these drivers are accelerating, but the gap is getting wider because we're failing to implement technology properly. We're failing to take into account it's not just about buying technology and turning it on, but it's about the transformation of the processes and involving the people, which include not just the people, the practice personnel, but actually the patients.
Hmm.
And so their own efforts have created an even wider gap. And so I see a lot of frustration there right now.
Yeah, it's amazing that you say that, because what I'm hearing and what I've seen as well is that it's not about not investing in technologies. We're finding businesses and organizations, many of the people on this call are making the investments, is that they're not able to bring it to fruition, to bring out the full potential of that technology. One of my favorite business books is a book called Good to Great. And in Good to Great, they talk about how do organizations make this transition from being good to being a remarkable organization that's able to deliver the promise of what they can offer to their market. What they talk about in that book that I really resonate with me, it's not using technology for the sake of putting technology in place. It's about using technology to accelerate the business. So it can't be a singular technology discussion. It's more robust than that. And one of the things I took away from this, it's really about how do we lead change versus how do we invest in technology kind of conversation. So Michael, I know that you've been involved with leading change in your organization for quite a while. So what do you think that has to shift to be able to make sure we're closing this gap? So what's your thoughts?
Well, excuse me, I think that there are a number of things that organizations can and should do when they're giving consideration to technology implementation, right? I mean, it goes beyond the kind of nuts and bolts kinds of things that responsible organizations do when they're putting together their criteria for requests for information, and they ultimately move to the RFP phase of technology acquisition. But you've got to accurately identify all of the key stakeholders, right? And all of your key stakeholders are not always within, the confines, the walls, the construct of your specific business, particularly in healthcare, and kind of piggybacking off of what Laird said earlier. You have to deal with the patient, and you have to get the patient's perspective and get a level of understanding of what the true patient need is, because that will actually help you to shape your technology acquisition strategy, and will kind of automatically force a narrowing of your acquisition efforts, because there's only certain types of technologies that are going to meet, a specific group of needs that you're trying to address.
It's interesting because in my introduction that Risa did for us, she mentioned I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've started 22 companies. My companies that have been most successful are the ones that I designed, I would say, backwards from the way most organizations work. Most organizations start with an idea that wherever they are in their business world at this point in time, and they design the solution out to the client. And what I've tried to do in one of the ones that have been most successful, start with the client and work backwards, right? Kind of follow it backwards, which often reminds me of a tenet I took away from one of Stephen Covey's book on leadership, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where he talks about, it's about kind of starting with the end in mind and working backwards from there. And so one of the things I think we want to look at here is, as we realize that that gap and that leadership that we need to do needs to be closed. Where do we, how do we get started with this, and where do we take it? So in the case, what I'm hearing, Michael, what you're saying is that we need to kind of look at the end in mind, work backwards, identify stakeholders, understand how do we actually meet them where they're at, and then how do we build that bridge to them. So how do you do this in the real world? Because you got fire drills you're putting out every day. You have competing demands and priorities that are grabbing your attention. So how do you actually make that happen in a business world real time?
Well, for me, it shows up in a series of, guess what, meetings with key stakeholders, right? And so for me, in our organization, there are multiple layers of management, as there are in most organizations. And I target a lot of my efforts around communicating with our extended leadership team. These are the people that are closer to our clinicians. They have more input, impact, and observability of the day-to-day operational focus and cadence. And so I have a series of meetings with them, standing meetings that I have with them, just to do intake, right? Just to do intake, things that they don't get an opportunity to share with my techs that are out servicing them, because oftentimes that's break fix kind of work, unless it's project implementation type work. And so I have a series of meetings. The other way that we try to facilitate that information intake and gathering is through governance, technology governance, where you have a standard way of ingestion for new tools and technologies that you want to consider for investment. And then there are parameters placed around that ingestion process or that governance process that provides some guidance and some guardrails, for lack of a better term. And then between my standing meetings and the technology oversight governance, you get some idea of the needs of various stakeholders within the business. You get an idea of what they're thinking about and what technologies that they're seeing, because let's face it, there's no way that a person in my role can know about all of the technologies that could be brought to bear in a specific vertical within your business. And so by using those mechanisms, you basically have a filtration function by way of the governance, but you also have a set of legs, eyes, and ears that are tied to the business. And now you've got that connection, that bridge, so that you've got bidirectional communication. And now you can help to shape the ideas and the overall technology portfolio, because I'm having meetings with all of my stakeholders, right? And so now I get an umbrella view.
So it really sounds like for you, where you focus is making sure you have the right stakeholders, you're having the right conversations with, to be able to take that information you're hearing from them and build that into your strategy that helps you prioritize what you're trying to do. Did I capture that correctly?
Captured it spot on, Tim, spot on.
Perfect. So what's interesting about the time that we're in today, I think we're in a point in time where there's going to be a tremendous sea change happening within healthcare. It kind of reminds me of almost back in the late 90s with the internet. We have gray hair, so most of us can remember kind of back what it was like in 97, 98, 99, when the promise of the internet was really starting to burst forward, right? And people, businesses were starting overnight trying to, capture that. You'd see the Super Bowl commercials, and they had all these startup companies that were selling furniture or, insurances or cars or whatever it happened to be. And everyone's going to be billionaire overnight. But what happened with that change, there's so much change that happened. It fundamentally changed the way we work as a society, right? The fact that we have cell phones, that we can order something from Amazon and 2 hours later it's in our hands, right? We've changed that model. So later, I'm going to go back to you a little bit here on this, is that if we look at this and we think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, and we want to be able to, kind of meet that opportunity like we did back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. How do we do that now? How do we actually, put a stake in the ground and start moving towards the future of healthcare?
Well, I think we have to get our head out of healthcare for a while.
Okay.
We think of, I think that the challenge is, well, we're healthcare, we're different. And we look at it just in the perspective of healthcare. I think we need to step out of healthcare for a moment and look at other industries. Who's really accelerated and done very well in those industries? You look at Amazon, for example, in the retail space. You look in finance, what we're seeing going on in finance to other markets. They're successful because they're addressing critical needs. They're addressing expectations of the market at large. And so if we look at how they're addressing the expectations of the market at large, can we also do that in healthcare?